Now, like many of you, I assume, I was disappointed that the Ukrainian counteroffensive seems to have gone not nearly as well as we had hoped. But I would ask that you step back from the map just a little bit and think about this counteroffensive as much more than just what you're seeing of tanks and infantry in the trench lines and stuck in minefields and all of this. Ukraine is doing what NATO calls multi-domain operations, where you integrate land, sea, air, cyber, and space effects together to try and achieve your objective. I believe the objective for their counteroffensive is not just penetrating the Russian lines. The objective is something much more significant. It's the liberation of Crimea. Crimea is in what we call in the military the decisive terrain. If you control Crimea, you have achieved the decision. You have won this war. And that's what Ukraine is going for. They want to liberate the Crimean Peninsula. Why is Crimea so important? Take a look at your map. The Crimean Peninsula was seized first by Catherine the Great back in the end of the 18th century because she needed it to protect Russia's coastline from the Ottoman Navy. And so whoever controlled the Crimean Peninsula could pretty much dominate the entire Black Sea. And that's why Russia took it back in the 18th century. And that's why they've tried to hold on to it since then. The Russian Navy base at Sevastopol is the biggest Navy base in the entire Black Sea. It's the home of the Black Sea Fleet. That place, the Crimean Peninsula, by the way, is about the size of Massachusetts, almost to the square meter. It's the same size as Massachusetts. But it is covered with Russian air bases, logistics bases, and of course the Navy base that I just mentioned. From Crimea, Russia is able to launch attacks against most of Ukraine. The Black Sea Fleet, which has turned out to be not a very good professional Navy, still has the ability to launch a lot of missiles against cities, towns, factories, hospitals, apartment buildings across Ukraine. And particularly against the seaport of Odessa. So Ukrainians know they'll never be safe or secure so long as Russia occupies Crimea. So they're not going to stop until they're able to liberate it. Now that's going to be pretty tough, of course, because Ukraine doesn't even have a navy. The Ukrainians also know that once the fighting has finally stopped, whatever it looks like, they will never be able to rebuild their economy as long as Russia occupies Crimea. Because from Crimea, Russia is able to block or disrupt all 5 Ukrainian seaports. You know, there are 2 important seaports on the Sea of Azov, Mariupol and Berdansk. Both of them were busy seaports before the war started, but now that the Russians have built this bridge, the famous Kerch Bridge, and they occupy Crimea, they stop all ships going in and out of the Azov Sea. So even after Mariupol and Berdansk are liberated, they'll never be able to rebuild and start contributing to the economy again. And then the other 3 main Ukrainian ports, Odessa, Kherson, and Mykolaiv, are all within easy reach of Russian missiles, drones, aircraft. So the Ukrainians are going to have to liberate it. And I think the way they're doing this is first by attempting to isolate it. That's what the ground assault phase of the counteroffensive is intended to do. But there's also, while attention has been up on Avdiivka and Bakhmut and all these places, Ukrainians are now getting across the Dnipro River at the lower Dnipro River, and they're on the left bank or the east side of the Dnipro River, doing river crossings, and they're gradually building up what we would call a bridgehead and expanding that bridgehead. And pretty soon they're going to be able to get enough troops into that bridgehead much closer to the entrance to the Crimean Peninsula than further up north of Tokmak, for example. So once they are able to get enough long-range weapons into that bridgehead and using what they already have, they're going to make it untenable, impossible for the Russians to stay with their Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol, or for them to continue to fly out of their big air base at Saki on the west side of Crimea, or to continue to use their major logistics hub called Zhenkoy at the northern part of the Crimean Peninsula. So in other words, To liberate Crimea, Ukrainians have to isolate it and then make it untenable for the Russians. That big Kerch Bridge, which they hit about a year ago, a little over a year ago, they are preparing for that now. They're gonna drop that bridge or damage it so severely when they're ready, and they'll have figured out multiple ways to do that. And of course, the Russians are anticipating that, so that'll be a fight. We're already seeing proof of concept, though, that the Ukrainians can make Crimea untenable by the withdrawal of the Black Sea Fleet, which has already begun to happen. And that was with just 3 Storm Shadow cruise missiles, which were provided by the UK. You'll remember a few weeks ago, there were Ukrainian special forces using jet skis and rubber boats were able to get onto the Crimean Peninsula and destroy a very important radar, which in effect blinded the west side of the Crimean Peninsula. And then using Storm Shadow and drones, they were able to hit the dry dock in Sevastopol. Now, a dry dock doesn't sound very sexy, but without a dry dock, you cannot do large-scale maintenance on ships. And so the dry dock has been destroyed by a missile provided by the UK. And the bonus was that there was a Russian submarine and a logistics ship sitting in that dry dock. So this was really brilliant targeting. Without the dry dock, the Black Sea Fleet can't stay there. And then just about 3 days later, with 2 Storm Shadows, they destroyed the headquarters of the Black Sea Fleet. And the loss of probably somewhere around 30 staff officers is a significant blow to the ability of the Black Sea Fleet to conduct operations. So they're having to move. They're having to relocate further to the east, probably towards Novorossiysk, which is a legitimate Russian port, about 300 or 400 kilometers further east. So this is proof of concept that with just a few precision weapons, the Ukrainians can achieve a decisive effect, which is why, I'm getting down to my last point here, which is why I have to say it's extremely frustrating that despite all of the aid that the Biden administration has helped to organize for Ukraine, with 50 nations working together, we have refused thus far to provide the long-range capabilities. That's the United States and Germany both have refused to provide the long-range capability that would enable Ukraine to finish the job with Crimea and also to destroy the Russian logistics and headquarters and artillery that supports these long, thick Russian defensive lines. We have finally provided some ATACMS, which is the best sort of land-launched rocket that we have. It's launched off of a HIMARS, but unfortunately, we did not provide the one with a range of 300 kilometers that has what's called a unitary warhead. Instead, we provided ATACMS that carry the cluster munitions, have a much shorter range, and they're not the kind of rocket you would want to use inside of Sevastopol, for example. So for some reason, the administration, which again has done so much to help Ukraine, it stopped short on what I think is the most important task, and that's to say it's our policy that Ukraine wins. We want Ukraine to defeat Russia, to eject Russia back to the 1991 borders of Ukraine. Instead, what we hear is we're with Ukraine for as long as it takes, which is a totally empty political statement.
General Ben Hodges' analysis in this video segment covers several key aspects of the Ukrainian military strategy and the geopolitical significance of Crimea in the context of the ongoing conflict with Russia. Number 1. Ukrainian counteroffensive strategy. Hodges acknowledges initial disappointment with the Ukrainian counteroffensive's progress. However, he emphasizes the importance of viewing this beyond just frontline combat. He describes Ukraine's approach as multi-domain operations, integrating land, sea, air, cyber, and space capabilities. Number 2. Objective: liberation of Crimea. Hodges believes that Ukraine's ultimate goal is not merely penetrating Russian lines, but the liberation of Crimea. He considers Crimea as the decisive terrain in this conflict, suggesting that controlling it is tantamount to winning the war. Number 3. Historical and strategic importance of Crimea. Hodges explains Crimea's historical significance, noting its seizure by Catherine the Great in the 18th century to protect Russia's Black Sea coastline. He points out the strategic value of Crimea in dominating the Black Sea and mentions the significant Russian naval base at Sevastopol. Number 4. Russian military capabilities from Crimea. From Crimea, Russia can launch attacks across Ukraine and control sea access. Hodges mentions that Russian Navy's capabilities to launch missiles against Ukrainian targets, highlighting the vulnerability of Ukrainian cities and infrastructure. Number 5. Economic and security implications. Hodges discusses the impact of the Russian occupation of Crimea on Ukraine's economy and security. He notes the disruption of Ukrainian seaports and the ongoing threat posed by Russian military capabilities within Crimea. Number 6. Ukrainian military tactics. Hodges details Ukraine's tactics in attempting to isolate Crimea through ground assaults and river crossings. He mentions the building of bridgeheads and the gradual accumulation of troops and long-range weapons near Crimea. Number 7. Attacks on Russian infrastructure. Hodges references successful Ukrainian attacks on Russian military infrastructure in Crimea, including the destruction of a radar site, a dry dock in Sevastopol, and a headquarters of the Black Sea Fleet. These attacks, he argues, demonstrate Ukraine's capability to significantly impact Russian operations. And number 8. Challenges and international support. Hodges expresses frustration over the limited range of military aid provided to Ukraine, particularly the lack of long-range capabilities. He criticizes the hesitancy of the U.S. and Germany to supply more effective weapons that could aid in liberating Crimea and disrupting Russian logistics and command structures. In summary, General Hodges' analysis underscores the strategic importance of Crimea in the Ukraine-Russia conflict, elaborating on Ukraine's military tactics and the broader implications of the ongoing struggle for control over this region. He also points out the challenges Ukraine faces due to limitations in international military support.